at the third day of the Uroboros Festival and at the second session today at the Feral Policy panel. I would like to welcome everyone here in the room and also everyone on Zoom. We have a hybrid event right now, so we have panelists and moderators joining us both here in Kasárna Karlín in Prague and also from all kinds of other places in the world via Zoom. And I will just do a very quick intro and then pass the floor to the panelists and the moderators. So we are really happy to have the Feral Policy panel in the program of the festival this year because most of you have probably heard already about the festival theme, Shedding the Skin, through which we are trying to look at the ecological and social transformation and the role of creative practice in this process of change from, let's say, more situated perspectives. So how do we actually perceive this kind of change in our very situated, personal, intimate, but also local, culturally situated context? And we are trying to speak to and engage diversity of stakeholders, both human and non-human. And one of those stakeholders are policymakers, which are obviously very important agents in this whole change. And I think that this event, this Feral Policy panel, is the one event at this festival that is really engaging this type of stakeholders directly. And of course, because it's part, this panel is kind of revolving around the theme of feral that is sneaking through the whole festival. It's going to discuss not just the human policy making, but also the idea of multi-species government and the role of more than human creatures in the environmental and eco-social policy making. So without further ado, I will pass the floor to Unlight, who is the in-person moderator and one of the persons who proposed this whole Feral Policy panel series. And yeah, I will wish everyone a good session.
Thank you, Marketa. So welcome. Really, my role here is to welcome everybody and to link this to the Creatures Project, which is organised this panel as part of the Uroboros Festival. And the Creatures Project is an EU-funded project of 3 years duration, looking specifically at what creative practice can bring to transformative futures. How do we make those transformations using imagination and reflection and prefiguration and all kinds of things that perhaps get left out when we just talk about moving populations and materials into more sustainable frames. To do that, of course, as Marketa was saying, we need to work really closely together with practitioners of all kinds as researchers. So we've been working a lot with creative practitioners, but also a lot with policymakers to try and understand what the different needs are and also to make the different worlds more legible to each other. So if you're a policymaker, how might you be evaluating something which comes from a really different space from the one you might be trained in or might be familiar with? And if you're a practitioner and you're wanting to be, more impactful, how might you style your work so that it is more legible to policy? So in that spirit, I want to hand over to Lara, who's doing online moderation and a proper introduction. That was really just to give you a sense of why the Creatures Project finds these relationships so important and why we're talking about it in terms of feral, but very much in terms of policy too. So may I hand over to the online world for Lara to open the session and introduce our panel.
Thanks, and so we've got a wonderful panel here. We conceived this is the second event in an ongoing series, and it's one where we wanted to prioritize knowledge exchange. So we've invited 4 panelists who are engaging with policy stakeholders in some way. Some are parts of policy processes that kind of are like cross-disciplinary, and others are creative practitioners who are situated more in the creative space, thinking, how do I connect my artworks to policymakers? So we've got 4 very brief presentations where each speaker is going to give an example of their practice, whether that's something they've been working on for ages or something that they've come very new to kind of share some of the mindsets and the soft skills that are kind of helpful for any creative practitioner that might want to connect their work into policy worlds. So without further ado, I'm going to invite the first speaker, Irina Zamurieva. She wears many hats, but today's hat is Climate Resilience Manager at Sniffer, and that's a Scottish charity that fosters collaborations across sectors for climate resilience. So I'm going to invite Irina to speak for 7 minutes, and then we'll go on to the next speaker. Okay, I'm just going to share Irina's slides now.
Cool. Thank you so much, Lara. Hi, everyone in the room and in the virtual room, and thanks so much for the very nice intro. So what I'm going to talk about today is what happens and how that happens when non-anthropocentric understanding of water meets flood risk management. And kind of the policy context of this is, I guess I have to start with maybe preempting that very often when we talk about policy, it's very easy to think about some very abstract process somewhere very far away happening in some national governments. And this is not what I'm going to talk about. What I will be talking about is something that is much more regional, based in Scotland. And there won't be any big bang story of how Scottish policy has changed afterwards. This is much more about the process of creating spaces for thinking about things differently. And we can, talk about those. What they do when we get to the discussion part. Can I have a next slide, please, Lara? Thank you. So something that Sniffer, the organization that I'm working with, has done for 25 years now is organizing this flood risk management conference in Scotland that is a big gathering of like 200 to 300 water practitioners in Scotland for like a 2 or 3 day knowledge exchange event. And it has been historically very kind of technical and evolving in the past few years to be a space where practitioners who work on water engineers, hydrologists, people who work in the public sector with water, people who do everything that would fall into the basket of water management. That's the UK policy terms and the Scottish policy terms for this. So the big area also is flooding, which is one of the key issues connected to climate change in Scotland. So it's like a very, very alive, very big topic because a lot of places are at risk of being flooded, and that's just getting worse. But yeah, it's mainly kind of technical engineers, planners kind of audience. And what we've tried to do in the past few years, can we have next slide, please? I've been involving a few different artists into this conference and into this process of trying to think of starting with water management, what a good, wholesome, ecological water management could look like. And we've been working with an amazing artist and eco-hydrologist, Nicole Manley, who came to the conference in her capacity both as an artist and someone who has also very technical understanding of water, and held these beautiful workshops called We're All Tributaries, where we invited conference participants to travel on a journey from a journey along the river, basically, that she filmed with underwater cameras from the Cairngorm Mountains, which are in the north of Scotland, all the way down to where it flows into the North Sea. And we had these different stops along the river where people could pause, reflect on what was in that video that she was showing, trying to imagine what does it mean to be part of this river, what this river as a water body looks like, who is it home for, what kind of water body it is with all its needs, desires, and liveliness. And that was quite a different space that you can imagine this kind of workshop set next to panel discussions with like senior Scottish government officials, public sector people who would be talking about, okay, how efficient are the flood defense measures, okay, how many properties have been protected, and poof, they go into this space that is like, wow, now we're imagining what the river is like, and we're having all these stops, and at each of the stops we're going to be writing poetry about each of this, so it's kind of, yeah, it takes you into a very, very different headspace. We also took the session a bit further and then held like a mini session based on this with more senior people that we've been working with to kind of do a bit more intimate, smaller group work on continuing to imagine what it's like to think with the river, not from the perspective of ideas like nature-based solutions or ecosystem services, and I'm doing the quote marks because, yeah, those are very specific policy speak terms, and we're thinking how to move away from those. Can we have next slide, please? Yeah, this is just a quick one to show you what it looked like. It involves lots of drawing, making things, like getting very physical, and here you could probably see it was very like conventional conferencey space, so it's quite a contrast of also doing these kind of weird, beautiful things in a space that is like, you're supposed to be doing something much more formal in here. Can we have next slide, please? Yeah. So where did that all get us? And that's a thing that is very difficult to trace. It's something that we are addressing in Creatures a lot of, okay, we're doing all of this beautiful creative work that expands the different ways of thinking and being with one another. So kind of some of the ways that we're able to trace what did that do, what effects it had. We saw that there were language shifts in the way that people would then talk about the different value of flooding, because moving away from thinking about flooding as a risk was a significant step in the way that these discussions are had, but thinking, okay, how is flooding significant as an event for the ecosystems that are reliant on this flooding? So kind of, not going with flooding is bad by default because it floods humans' houses, which is, big perception. The other shift that we were able to kind of see, again, through all these informal conversations is thinking how people would speak about the needs and desires of other species. And this was something very linked to this, the language shifts around moving away from risk, but then kind of, disassembling the human or decentering human as the only kind of creature that has a relationship with flooding. And the final one is this kind of soft-ish space for building capacity to imagine those different futures where water policy can be done differently, kind of flowing from those different ideas of living together with one another. Next slide, and I think that's the last one. I don't have to go into too much detail maybe about this, but this is a few words on the kind of the back story of this, because I think often you hear kind of, this is what we've done, and this is this big thing, and I think it's always, for me personally, very interesting to hear, okay, how did this actually come about? And a few important things in the way that this whole process came about, and the way we as SNF also work with creative practitioners very often is very much reliant on a lot of us seeing the value in these processes, and it often takes a lot of convincing and building alliances with others in different spaces who you would think you are, basically building a network of crazy allied others or something like that, who would be like, yeah, doing this crazy thing as this like very formal conference, yeah, why not? Let's do it. And kind of building relationship with those people has been very important, and the whole, relationships has been very key to bringing this weirdness about. And another one around encouraging experimentation also was very important in holding that space, because that involved moving away from these kind of very, I want to say formal, but maybe there's a better word for it that I can't find right now. A space where, you have to, there's lots of deadlines, you have to get a lot of things done, there's a lot of responsibility, and the stakes are very high for making mistakes, so kind of opening up a space where people can just experiment and engage with the water in a way that isn't kind of having this big implication necessarily right afterwards, but giving people a space to fail, I think was very important there. And creating a space for asking questions was another big one, because in the environments where there's a lots of delivery mindsets where, okay, we have to deliver this flood risk management scheme, and then there's another scheme, and there's another policy cycle. There's very little space that these kind of people have for thinking otherwise, thinking differently, getting together, reflecting, asking questions. So that was a big value that, you know, we've gathered from it. And I'm just going to close with reading a very short poem that we've collectively wrote. It doesn't have a single author, so I can't cite. It's just written by the engineers, planners, participants of this. Calm, flowing life force. The water full of life comes and goes, flowing. My life carries on as normal. Nothing is normal. All has wonder. Thank you.
Thank you, Irena. That was a particularly beautiful presentation that really just encapsulates what we're talking about here. People with really radically different worldviews and constructions on water, and some people that kind of even embody those two worldviews and creating some of the spaces to make those translations. And I'm going to introduce our next speaker. So Ruth, maybe you want to start sharing your slides while I introduce you. So I'm delighted to welcome next Ruth Catlow, who is Artistic Director and co-founder of Furtherfield, which is London's longest running D-Centre for Art and Technology. Over to you, Ruth.
Unmute. Okay. Yeah, thank you. It's lovely to be here. Yes, so I'm an artist, researcher, and co-director of Furtherfield. We've long been, we're an arts and technology organisation focused on eco-social change, and we've run online since 1996 and opened our first gallery in 2004. But we moved to a pavilion in the heart of London's Finsbury Park in 2019. So in this slide, you can see on the left a view of the gallery, us looking at this kind of pavilion in a Victorian park. And on the right is the view from the gallery out into the Victorian Park. And our experience of hosting exhibitions for this super diverse community in which 200 different languages are spoken, many migrant communities moving in and around the park. It's really inspired us to completely change our model of operation from kind of a funnel for international arts, the best of international arts, into a site for, or a platform for cultivating and hosting local insights, co-creation, experience and imagination. And we've been working with different local groups and connecting with different characters, park characters and communities, from local residents to the Parks Department and local councillors as a part of this work.
Ruth, you're on mute actually again.
Thank you.
So if you could maybe just repeat one sentence.
Yes. I am going to talk about the Treaty of Finsbury Park 2025. This is a collaborative project with the Creatures Research collaboration, and it depicts the story of the dawning of an interspecies democracy. It's a new era of equal rights for all living beings, and where all species come together to organise and shape the environments and cultures they inhabit in Finsbury Park, in urban green spaces across the UK, the world and beyond. Like many urban parks, Finsbury Park is in real life and in the fiction fraught with environmental issues, from noxious gases, traffic noise, to governance struggles and financial sustainability problems that have in real life resulted in a running feud between residents and the council over the hosting of corporate festivals to fund green infrastructure in the borough. So the treaty, I'll just call it the treaty from now on, is based around a set of LARPs, or live action role play games, that are all played from more than human perspectives to encourage the blooming of a bountiful biodiversity and to take interspecies political action. So we invite players to join a series of interspecies assemblies to think and feel like a kind of dog or bee or grass, to help change the way we all see and participate in our local urban green spaces forever. So our kind of core aim here is to build new empathy pathways to all the life forms of the park, human and more than human. We've been developing LARPs as a playful co-creation practice for about 6 years now at Furtherfield. So LARPs are games of collective make-believe. So the kinds of games you played as a child. Let's play hospitals. You be the doctor, I be the nurse. Oh God, what's happened to you? Oh, call the ambulance. You know, it's kind of like, so we make stuff up. There's a situation, we all respond and we all get into character. It's deeply immersive. So LARPs need a setting, a scenario, and a cast of characters. And we like this format because through it, people can reimagine and reconfigure established roles and relationships in order to prefigure new realities that they want to see and to rehearse them. So the LARPs we make take the form of an invitation to a variety of people who have a stake in its themes or the place where it is set. So here you can see we put out a 1-minute video call, which was an invitation to join the interspecies assemblies. So this is just a still from that film. And we've been iterating participatory formats with our LARPs, for instance, treaty bills on rituals and multi-species governance structures that I developed for an algorithmic food justice LARP with Sarah Heitlinger. I saw Sarah's in the audience. Hello, Sarah. And Laura Houston, our very own Laura Houston. And we made this in 2019. And treaty is kind of taking many of the things that we developed there and then reworking it in a different context. So in preparation for this, I was kind of ready just to tell the story of what we did. And then as usual, Laura gave us some really useful prompts. And it made me realize that it's actually quite interesting and valuable when thinking about creatives connecting into policy and vice versa, actually to reflect on the background of how this game came to be the shape that it is. So I'm going to tell you about the background. So it's a 5-year public game that centers around assemblies to design and host the world's first interspecies festival. So this is like a very particular and strange game. So where did this concept come from? Well, it came from really a lot of background work and talking to a lot of people and learning about a lot of things. So it was initially conceived in collaboration with Cade DM at the New Design Congress in Berlin. And in response to, like as an emotional response to reports of mass species extinction that were coming out in 2019 that are obviously still true. And we wanted to apply the same lens to the park that both New Design Congress and Furtherfield had been using to critique the political impact of global digital technology systems. So we specifically focused on the harms done to all life on the ground, often done by management systems and infrastructures that are designed by humans from a distance. Sorry, that's a little bit chewy, but like, let's just think about this. So it's like what it feels like to be on the ground, living in a system that was designed by someone who's never been there, who are applying all kinds of engineering principles to what life on the ground, how life on the ground should be ordered and managed. And we wanted to explore how to engage meaningfully with all park communities to discover what matters to them and how their interests might better shape its economies and stewardship. To do the research for this, I ended up doing really a lot of zooming in and out to understand how biodiversity health is understood at a local, national and international level. So from local biodiversity plans, the work of other artists and designers, to news stories, to the biodiversity strategies of Natural England and IPBES. So I looked at the tools, the data, what stories are told, and what language is used.
Sorry, Ruth, just 1 minute left.
Okay, so I'm going to now skip ahead. A lot was learnt is all I'm going to summarize. A lot was learnt so that I can now just show you a little bit of what happened. LARPs use stories as technologies, and in the case of Treaty, the story is about a new technology called a sentient style. And this is a fictional device that allows humans to tune into all the flora and fauna of Finsbury Park. It also matches players to mentor species from the park and provides them with masks or animated face filters so we see no human faces. So players are very deeply immersed in the game. Here are some images of the mentor species. These are chosen for the fact that the image of these creatures and different species are very strongly matched to Finsbury Park. And here's, in the last year, 60 people have joined interspecies assemblies to play the Treaty of Finsbury Park in person in the park. And in online assemblies using these digital animated face masks. They've devised festival ideas by exploring interspecies cultures and cooperation, and digging into logistical considerations has been especially rich. 3 of these festival ideas are now in development for a spring voting event, and we expect 2,000 plus people to get involved in a public vote and to choose the interspecies festival activity and then to play them together. So I'm going to finish up. Lara said in her prompts, what are 3 things we wish we'd known before we started the work? So I'll just finish with a short reflection on this. It takes a really long time to do this work. When we initially planned Treaty, we planned it as a 1-day event in the summer of 2020. Then the pandemic happened, everything slowed down. We tried to think about how to do it online, and everything like suddenly went into slow-mo. But while we spent a lot of time getting exasperated at how long everything was taking, we discovered that we could build something much more powerful if we spread it over a long period of time. And it allows the work to embed with different stakeholders over time and as contexts shift. This also allows us to do much deeper reflection with people over time. 2 last things. Look for every opportunity to root the work in place with themes, imagery, sound, people, because it means that people really then make an emotional connection both to the themes and the place. Connect with and involve as many people as possible who have a very strong stake in the change you want to see. Have them play, have them interested in the outcomes of the play. And finally, don't underestimate the work it takes to convert the arty bollocks and the theory that you have to consume into something which is inviting for more people. This is like really a lot. It's the major part of the work, is to make this work inviting for many people and to make people feel at home in it.
Oh, thank you so much, Ruth. And just to reassure you, we've got an extended discussion session, so I can't wait to dive further into some of those details, especially what you were just talking about, the kind of development of the relationships that Irina also touched on so crucially. So next, I would love to invite Marion Lane would you want to share your slide? Brilliant, Marion. So Marion is a design coach and innovation fellow at the Centre for Digital Citizens at Newcastle University. Thanks for being here, Marion.
Thank you, that should be me unmuted. Awesome. Cool. So yeah, I'm here with also a number of hats, but always in this kind of intersection of policy and design. And my biggest hat for the moment, or the one that's paying me anyway, is I'm in this role of co-design coach at the UK Department for Food, Environment and Rural Affairs. And in this job, I'm coaching, training, inspiring people who are involved with policymaking processes to adopt experimental approaches and involve different sorts of people in these processes. So I'm also an innovation fellow at Centre for Digital Citizens, and that's supporting work with different rural communities. So as a brief introduction to my own creative background, So my journey goes from printed textiles in Dundee in Scotland to where I am now. I mean, this is my kitchen, but I'm typically based in Westminster, so in a team in central government supporting these new processes. So throughout my design training, I found myself drawn to problems that required research about people and their lives, as well as to the aesthetic and textile sensibilities of materials, so very traditional textile design. And this, of course, didn't really fit with the system that we were in for design training. It's about 10 years ago. So textile designers made beautiful things, product designers solve problems. So kind of to help me to uncover my own dilemma, I've undertaken PhD research. So the methods I used there use the human body as a research tool, so really thinking about the senses and how we could use that to explore and create meaningful experiences with different technologies. So this type of methods included material handling, model making, workshops, sensory ethnography. So the theoretical contribution of this work is the paradigm of textile thinking as a research methodology. So the image that you're seeing here are aspects of this methodology. And the idea is to establish values in textile design that can inform practice and design of services and systems that inform, which impact human experience. So the aspects are finding synergies and using tacit knowledge, experimenting with materialities, crossing boundaries and building relationships, developing new practices, engaging technology, problem setting rather than problem solving, and knowledge exchange. And this framework supports textile designers who are engaging with those in the margins, acknowledging intersections, and empowering others through their practices. So the aim is that these approaches can inform the design of future intervention systems and policymaking, which is based on real and varied lived human experiences of those affected by their impact. So to contextualize the type of work I'm doing now, which is in this policy space, I was sort of delighted to find the work, recent work of Anna Witcher, who has helped me anyway to understand a bit of what design can contribute to policy. So I hope this might be useful for other practitioners thinking about where their work might kind of fit or be able to add value. So I'll introduce 3 ways that design is contributing to policy, and then I'll translate some of that theory into practice using some examples of work I've done actually in another government department, working on broadband policy. So firstly, the rise of futures thinking. This is about making space for creative thinking, and this might include speculative design, utopian and dystopian futures, forecasting, and the prototype. Changing the nature of evidence is about sharing control, bringing diverse voices to the table, looking for opportunities to colour big data with thick data, evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence, and that reminder that economists are not the only gatekeepers of policy. Finally, more meaningful public consultation is about creating connections, so connection between people and stakeholders across different policy areas. So that might include more creative and proactive consultation, meaningful engagement, not tick box exercises, and gamification of consultation. So going straight in, I enjoyed that. You said it was chewy, Ruth, but infrastructure is designed from a distance. This is exactly the problem that I've been kind of dealing with, I suppose. So kind of trying to explain or help policymakers to understand the lives of people who are very far and very different from them. So this Rural Snakes and Ladders board game, this is artwork created by David Tom, and the data is collected from walking interviews by Kate Hopkins. So this is designed out of a series of conversations about the difficulties of bringing ethnographic research findings to life and making them meaningful as a context for policy development. So I hope you're familiar with the idea of snakes and ladders. When something's good, you've got the ladder. When something's rubbish, you fall down the snake. So all the scenarios are based on real data points from rural research, giving the player, who should be policymakers who have done some workshops with the people who are actually working in this policy space, access to real life scenarios that they might not have previously thought as being significant. So the player encounters a wide range of data points, and that gives them the opportunity to reflect on the lives of rural farmer with poor broadband connections in this example. So these screenshots are from an interactive experience designed for policymakers to visit a rural setting without leaving their office. So I've worked a lot with different rural communities, and a real kind of objective for me is telling the story about rural life in ways that are not kind of glamorizing the idyll of the digital detox, which is very familiar to your urban policymakers, or that pure isolation from, like, say, poor internet or other lack of opportunities, but to capture actually the energy and ideas which exist in that middle space. So the super sheep here is designed by rural primary schools at Weirhead Primary. And this is just one example of a future technology that they hope to see in their local communities as a result of improved broadband speeds. And this is a unique opportunity to really see inside the mindsets of children from farming communities, many of whom will probably and likely go into farming themselves. So really about their aspirations and hopes for the future. So fiber dialectogram is an illustrated ethnography. This is imagery and experiences of people who are actually upgrading to a higher internet speed. So this is a collaboration with myself as the researcher and illustrator Mitch Miller. And it was commissioned to develop an evidence base for the impact of interventions to improve connectivity. So this project is data materialization. So it captures experience. It's using a material, it's paper, to both record findings, so the stories, and display information. And then we also use this to actually engage the participants. So we were there in a village with a big piece of paper, so it was an unusual sight. So this was a way of actually engaging people who were maybe not familiar with drawing as a research tool, but also in fiber dialectogram, we consider how else we can kind of gather information. And this is important as it enables voices who might not normally take part in, say, policy consultation and research to actually get or be included in this type of work. So yeah, creative policy making. I'm never sure where the creative should sit or which part, but Lara had asked, yeah, some of the kind of challenges and maybe opportunities for the collaboration opportunity. So in the current role I have now at DEFRA, I'm connecting people with ideas. So we do refer to the farming community as an Indigenous group. And so then it's how are we learning to listen and then co-create together. So we are using this practice, which we call co-design. And it can be a clash of kind of systems. We've got government, we've got farmers, we've got the natural world, and then you're also adding in creatives. So yeah, we do have this imperative to work together. We want to make a difference, but it's scary. It's feral, maybe. Yeah, I think we're here for it. So just some kind of challenges there. I thought time and kind of investment and getting creative people involved is a bit of a blocker. Resources and then access. So I've worked with various creative practitioners, but I've not been able to share the research data that we've collected because it's owned by kind of government. And then it's like, how can we give the creative practitioner we're working with enough to really be able to tell the stories they're hoping to tell? And then on the other side, challenges for policy people working with creatives. Irina touched on the same kind of challenges, but really taking the time to understand and imagine, to think about the problems and the stories before kind of jumping into like a shiny document, a nice poster, making space for creatives and creative thinking. So just a reminder that policy folk are creative too. And so something that I do in my work is I run a pop-up lab or studio, which is a fortnightly space. It's actually online, but it's a space to come and try out new ideas, learn about new methods, and see what else is happening and how that might be able to be applied to your policy practice. Yeah, and then there's something around permission to play. So we've got the kind of green book, which is this formal book about how to do evaluation in government, and it's now kind of including co-design practices and user-centered design practices. But creating room to experiment also creates a risk. So kind of looking at ways that we can encourage more risk-taking and failure, really. Be okay with that.
Would it be okay to leave it there, Marion?
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, thank you so much. You've really given us such a rich roadmap of where creative practice and policy are. I really love to see that image and some really great insights that we could pick up on the discussion. And last but not least, we've got Julia Lohman. Julia, if you want to share any slides that you have. And Julia is Professor of Contemporary Design Practices at Aalto University in Finland and founder of the Department of Seaweed. And Julia is going to give us a short presentation and then we can have a little stretch and move about. And we've got our 4 panelists to have an incredible discussion, plenty of time for questions from the online and in-person audience. So this is just the beginning. So please go ahead, Julia.
Thank you, Laura, and hello, everyone. So yes, a lot of what was said completely resonates. So as Lara said, I am joining you today from Finland. Originally, I'm from Germany, but educated in the UK, and I moved to Finland in 2018 with my family as I became professor of practice in contemporary design at Aalto University. And I'm completely in love with seaweed and have been working with algae since 2007, when I found it as I was artist in residence in Japan, and I found it on the fish market and got enthralled by its beauty. So today I'm just going to very briefly talk about material and mindset, seaweed and communities, creative practices, and ocean literacy. So when we're talking about creative practices, about design specifically for me, it's so easy to see it as being very different to policy making. But I really love this quote by Herbert Simon, who says, "Everyone designs who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. The intellectual activity that produces material artifacts is no different fundamentally from the one that prescribes remedies for a sick patient, or the one that devises a new sales plan for a company or a social welfare policy for a state." So really, as designers, we're trying to figure out how to change a situation to a preferred one and what that preferred one might be, and how we actually, and for whom it is preferred, for it to become an equitable, fair future society that we're aiming for. So when you understand design in this way, you have this extended frame of it, that we're suddenly kind of not just making posters and toasters, but we are engaging into questions where we're going as a society, how we can get there, and also into the realization that everything that we design kind of designs us back. Everything that we're making essentially changes the trajectory we're on and changes us back. So we have to really consider what we're putting into the world and what world might be created because of that. So when I'm designing myself, I decided to share a few of the processes that I'm doing when I'm designing. I transform an organism, which is algae in my case, into a material and then into an artifact. And on this timeline of transformation, my reflections really go into the macrosphere and into the microsphere, as I'm trying to bring together information that I need to know what I should be doing. So basically, I might be starting with a blade of seaweed and playing with it and seeing what I could do, go and make kind of the first constructions, first artifacts, then figure out that I need to change the kind of molecule structure of the algae or the material properties. So I might bake a cake for a scientist and actually say, can I come and share coffee break with you and ask you to do some diagrams about molecules, for example, and go into this microsphere and figure out what it is I'm doing and why and how. And then I might reflect upon which algae I should use in which ecological system and how this might affect the system. This is one of the reasons why I love algae so much, because you can actually grow it in a way that it benefits the ecosystem, that it pulls out the excess nutrients that are in the seas and damage the seas, and that it kind of creates a habitat for other species that would not possibly be there without this algae farm. And finally, kind of the artifact or the process towards an artifact comes about, but really it's about this assembly of knowledges, and in a way the process is perhaps more important than the artifact itself. So I think this is something we as creative practitioners can offer to scientific fields and can offer to policymakers, that we have this broad array of possible methods that we are all allowed to use. We can really play, we can really kind of engage people, and we can help maybe articulate things that might not be as tangible without our input. So for example, I collaborate with a marine biologist, and he says, everyone who reads his papers actually knows what's going on. So his big question is, how can I reach beyond the scientific community? How can I actually reach the people who really matter, whose deeds are actually causing these effects in the ocean? What do I need to do? And he turns to creative practitioners, or even sometimes employs creative practices himself to actually reach beyond his own disciplinary boundaries. In 2013, I was invited as part of my PhD at the Royal College of Art to the Victoria and Albert Museum for half a year, and I founded the Department of Seaweed that was operating under the premise that seaweed is as important as any of the other materials for making that might have had or have their departments at the V&A: textiles, ceramics, silverware, and glass. So in this department, we were working as a community of practice, and we were sharing the process from not knowing to testing to experimenting to playing to the very first kind of prototypes and artifacts. And because we were sharing this very malleable space of practice rather than a final artifact, people who came into this room immediately felt that they could relate, and they could relate and look and imagine what we're making from their own angle. So they were coming and saying, oh, wow, this is quite, you know, I'm an architect, have you tried making insulation material? And we would start discussing their possible algae futures that they imagine in their head. And it became such a powerful imaginatory space that was created by our community, but to a large extent also by the algae as an organism, because it is so vibrant, because you can explore it through all senses. So I think this is something that happens when you are bringing creative practice in the room, and especially when you're working with biomaterials, that somehow there's a non-human presence in the room that actually engages us in a way that brings our emotions out. So people would share stories of having their legs entangled, of walking on beaches, of eating Asian food. And through these stories, they came to our project not in an intellectual way, but in an emotionally engaged way. So the biomaterials I work with become more than just materials. They become our familiar spirits and influence all aspects of the creative process. A familiar spirit is perhaps the cat of the witch or the frog that allow them to do the magic that they've been doing. And I think a biomaterial is doing the same thing, that you are taking another viewpoint that allows you to reflect differently on your own agency, on your own practice. Here is how it felt to be in the Department of Seaweed. So somehow the pieces, the materials, the objects took on their own life, and somehow it just was not completely controlled what we were doing, but our own deeds as designers were shaped by seaweedness, and how how that seaweedness could be enhanced through our acts of engaging with it.
Julia, just 1 minute left.
1 minute. I'm going to skip this now, but you can kind of see that this is the thing I developed, this whole idea of co-speculation, looking together at possible futures. And I think this is a really important tool for policymaking, that you can imagine and envision many possible different futures. But I want to leave you with one thing that I think is crucial and that I think we need to engage with. I think with everything, every change we're trying to make towards a more eco-socially just future, we always have to engage people with a head, heart, and hand, known as this head, heart, and hand model. But we have to engage with knowing, acting, and caring, with kind of engaging people's emotions as well as their agency, as well as their care within the system we're trying to influence. And for me, this is what creative practitioners can offer, that we can translate from one to the other, that we can assess what is missing, and that we in a way can be the flux in between the three, really growing this strong network together. And that's my last slide.
Oh, thank you so much, Julia. So could I invite the people in the Zoom room and the in-person room in Prague to give our panelists a big hand. I thought that was a truly phenomenal set of presentations. So I'm going to invite particularly the Zoomers to stand up and do a stretch and kind of move your body if you've been sitting down, paying good attention to the presentations. And just to take a minute to think of any questions you would like to ask the panelists, any burning themes that you would like to point out. And particularly if any of the panelists want to kind of respond to each other's work. So I'm going to have a stretch too. All right, wonderful. I can see Anne's having a stretch and Irene getting a drink. All very important embodied acts of Zoom practice. Okay, so now we're gently going to transition into the discussion session. And I wondered if any of the panelists had some reflections on each other's presentations. If you do, just raise your hand, or Irena's got the microphone that she can speak into. And if not, we can turn to the Zoom rooms and take some questions from the audience. I can see Ruth Catlow's hand up, please. Ruth, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to hear from the other presenters how you feel or how you deal with this, sorry, I haven't formulated the words, how you deal with this idea of like engaging with, taking seriously the needs and interests of other species as though they are equal to humans. I'm interested to know like what obstacles you faced and maybe what tools you use to go deeper into that and to kind of get around any resistance that you may encounter, especially in the kind of more formal engineering, policy, management settings.
Yeah, maybe I can speak to that. I feel like Ruth is looking at me somewhat, asking that question, perhaps. I think, well, the first thing to say is probably that the term, kind of the way that you framed it just now, at least, in the way that we talked about it in some of these more public sector policy spaces, and internally, even in the team, kind of this idea of bringing other species as like equal to humans of sorts, it has a really huge assumptions that all humans are treated well already, or that there is some equal way of treating humans, but you know, this is clearly not the case, right? So it's kind of, what standard of human are we thinking about? Is this just, you know, white, male, cisgender person who has been European, yep, who has, had the privilege of being treated in a way, that is kind of treated as this is a standard to bring everyone towards. So I think kind of we spend a lot of time with different people trying to unpack that and see kind of what would be the other ways of framing, like, does multi-species as a term like captured better? It also has its own kind of nuances. So kind of, I guess that's one, it's not direct answer to your question, it's more for these challenges that we had in raising it and talking about this. But in, it's been interesting when you raise this kind of the feral, multi-species, modern human in those contexts, it kind of seems almost very straightforward and very kind of, there's something very obvious about our people who work at, say, like SEPA, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, or like, but it's like, of course we care about the environment, like this is our jobs, this is what we do, this is this big part of our work and life. But then kind of being able to kind of unpack it from the, okay, but how is the wider policy landscape framing the way that those people engage with it, and kind of the way that, you know, it's almost doing this like mini talks on what's the problem with the whole nature-culture divide? Why is that problematic? That has been like very important, not easy to articulate when you have like a space of like, 1 hour meeting to discuss a whole bunch of ideas, and then in a few minutes you need to summarize why the nature-culture distinction, why thinking of humans as, outside of nature is problematic. But I think that has been like a big thing that we were trying continuously to raise, that yes, you can work in the Environmental Protection Agency, and yet you can still approach that as there's nature over there that needs to be protected. And yeah, kind of we're thinking, okay, how do we go from there? So it's kind of being able to link each of those kind of little resistances, little questions, little kind of things that come up in those conversations back to really fundamental questions of how we know how the world is, and kind of meeting people where they are without being, let me give you a lecture over here, but more kind of like, this is where I'm coming from. And I think it was Lara's framing in one of our other events of kind of talking about creating these spaces where we can question these bigger ideas of why we think the things we think, without questioning people's like ontological security, that they still feel that they can bring themselves and wherever they are into that conversation, and we can, talk very openly about our ideas and then resolve it somehow, perhaps. So there's some rambles in response.
Oh, thanks, Irina. That's named a few really important issues that I'm sure will resonate. And I wanted to go to Julia, who wanted to follow up with Ruth's question as well.
Yes, it's a really good question, Ruth. And I think it's actually quite often about asking the questions, like allowing this strange attempt, which is fraught with problems, to raise the questions you need to ask. So one of the questions I think immediately that gets raised is this idea about the rights of an individual versus the rights of a community, or of the survival of a species, for example, in a certain spot versus the survival of each single one. And immediately when you have a question like this raised, you're like, oh wow, this is the whole field that we could now continue discussing for an hour. And I think that's the whole point of it, that you're trying to change the point of view that you're looking from, and through that change suddenly all these questions bubble up and you can start discussing them. And I think you were saying that it's more about the process than the outcome, that you realized, yeah, you can try and do it in one day, but what's the point of even getting to the end of the result of the day? Because it's actually about the process of being in this unknown space together with others and trying to figure out what makes sense and how we can make it just a bit more just, in that steps, by just asking these questions. So I think that's what it's about.
Oh, Marion, I thought your presentation gave so many kind of ways of doing that, like the mapping slide that you showed of Anna Witcher, where we're sort of stuck in particular modes of thought, but we're also trying to use these tools to kind of change the language at the same time as taking these kind of urgent forms of action. I thought you gave us a really concrete sort of ways that creative practice is already kind of responding, from opening up futures to kind of connecting with communities and participants in different ways.
Yeah, for sure. And I keep trying to remember to say the word already, because it was the same with my thesis work, looking at what textile designers do. It wasn't new work, it was just put together in a way that was perhaps accessible, because people are always experimenting. And yeah, there's kind of just that kind of showing your work sort of thing, like how do we do it? How do we get to under the noses of whoever seemingly is holding the pen and the power? But yeah, I think that kind of idea of actually, Julia and I had a similar sort of experience, I think, where the pop-up, the space within the V&A, and I kind of do this pop-up, which is virtual, but it's making space for people to just stop and think, and that seems to be really important in the way that I'm working at the moment. But yeah, often it takes an opportunity like this today to reflect and be like, oh, yeah, that's what I've been doing, because even, we're supposed to be these practitioners sharing our work, but even we forget to stop and say, oh, that's what it is.
Brilliant. Well, Anne, I've got a question in the chat from Chris Harris. Do you mind if I go maybe take one online question first, and then if anyone has a question in the room in Prague, does that work for you?
Yes, that works. Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
Great. So Chris, do you feel like unmuting and asking your question?
Sure, yeah. Thank you, Laura. First of all, thanks all the panelists for sharing such amazing perspectives on the role of creative practice and policy design. And so much of my thinking recently in my practice, I've been trying to think about how to use creative practice for systems change, but neglecting the fact that there are already so many people thinking about systems change from the policy perspective to engage with. So it's just been really useful. Thank you. I started typing my question in the chat, but then pressed enter by mistake and ended up with a Q. So here I am. But my question for the panelists was going to be, I've seen quite a lot in these examples of really amazing prompts to kind of in-person conferences or facilitation techniques, or to think about new imaginaries, new languages, new LARPs, new games, and these seem to be really good kind of one-time events, even though, if it just allow me to call it that for a moment, even though there's a lot of process that leads up to a particular intervention. And I was wondering if there's any experiences or examples from the panelists of almost like take-home activities, or like take-away new languages, imaginaries, LARPs out of any of these explorations that people continue to do almost semi-autonomously outside of the initial presentation or intervention.
This is a great question. From events to habits, maybe. Really important to point out the timeline there. Would any of the panelists like to take this? I sort of feel, Irina, you've been doing the multi-year work within the conference.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. So in our case, we had, I would say, almost a luxury of working with the same core group of people behind this conference over a number of years. So it's also a relationship that we've built with them. So kind of the conference is organized in a way that we are doing like a big part of this work, but there's also a steering group that comprises key public sector bodies where someone has something to do with water. So it's kind of really the key organizations that are involved in it, and quite like senior people that having a say of where they think this field should be moving towards, that shapes the way that the conference is. So it's less like, it's not about what they do like as their habits kind of things. It's much more the question that we are, I think, guided by is what can they take away that would allow them to do their work differently. And in a lot of instances, I think it's about kind of empowering is a bad word. What's a better word than empowering? Kind of giving them a sense that they can go away to their departments. Inspiring is a better one. Kind of helping them to feel more confident that these kind of ways of thinking about water, in this case, are legitimate, and creating a kind of a sense that they can go and confidently speak to their finance departments, for example, of why they need to spend X amount more money on a thing that isn't necessarily looking like a worthwhile thing to spend money on from the finance department. So it's kind of building the kind of conceptual argument toolkit thing. And because we do have this process that it happens yearly, we're able to we don't pick it up like, we don't start from scratch every year. So it's kind of being able to kind of look back, okay, where have we gotten last year with this? What shifts have occurred? How can we keep on pushing that in this direction of more socially, ecologically just futures through this water theme? So it's very much about, I guess, like future thinking, multi-species thinking, capacity building. That is the work. Hopefully that answers it somehow.
And what about the snakes and ladders game, Marion? Do you get to take it home? I want to play that right now.
Yeah, so like I think we talked earlier in the week about this thing of being a creative person and getting these like really short contracts, and like it's not really conducive to sustainable practice. And I think I'll definitely take advantage of the privilege of having been inside government, because we have things like training programs and leadership programs. I didn't know what leadership was when I was studying textile design, but if you come up with an idea and you want it to carry on, it's good to identify others in the community who may want to continue that. So definitely with these kind of pop-up research things I was doing in a previous government department, I found people who were interested and up for it. And then when I inevitably left, because these contracts end, it continues and it has a life, which is really exciting. And I think like the kind of influencing skills are underrated, and definitely wouldn't be something I knew I should be doing. But of course, people want to be inspired and they have good ideas. So it's a really positive thing to keep things rolling. The actual Snakes and Ladders, there's a few copies of it, but it was made during COVID and it's digital, which is always slightly disappointing to me being from a materials background. So there is a version of it which is magnetic and it's on the wall in that government department. So people can go and play it. And in my fantasy, they're all playing it on their lunch break. I have no idea if that's the truth, but it's there.
Oh, that's fabulous. Thanks. And maybe we could go to the Prague group and see if there's any questions in the audience. Over to Anne.
May I invite questions from what is for us an embodied space where we actually are? Is there anybody who would like to venture something towards anyone on the screen or in the room? Well, there was one question that I wanted to pose, if I could, but that's just going to hold the space while others might be thinking of more questions. Lara and I, we work at the University of Sussex as researchers, and that has a certain expectation of what evidence looks like. And I was thinking that, both for policy and for practice of other kinds, creative practices of other kinds, evidence might mean something very different from what it might do in a university context, such as the one that we're working together in. So I just wanted to see if anybody wanted to respond to that while we're waiting for other questions.
Maybe we could hear.
What does evidence, there's somebody wanting admitting for a start. What does evidence look like if you're a creative practitioner? What does evidence look like if you're a policymaker? How do you actually understand, because we do research, we try and prove things, or, we have various different ways of understanding evidence, but I think that really differs from where you're looking. All right, now I've silenced the panel as well as the room. Come on, room, there must be a question that's easier to answer than that. I've set the bar really low.
And anybody from the Zoom room like to ask any questions? Oh, let's hear from Julia Lohman. Over to you, Julia.
I can take your evidence question.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you.
Of course, it scares everyone. We've been scared by that word. But of course, but it's kind of, because in a way, that's always the question, how you do this. Because we're talking about an entanglement, and a lot of the creative practices about getting people even more entangled, about it, being richer and thicker and more and multi-layered and multi-sensorial. And then when you're afterwards asked, like, okay, can you put this into a number? And you say, oh yeah, it's 3.7. It's like, it's always such a come down. But quite often, of course, that's what's required. So we have to figure out how to be a bit smart about this, and how to, I don't know, use, for example, in my case, visitor numbers to the museum to at least have like a trail of this. And I think if we are able to supplement kind of this quantitative numbers with qualitative insights, that that we actually just have a book there that people can write in when they say, oh, this has really affected me, that we are able to kind of save the email that they might send 2 years later when they say, you know what, I'm still thinking about this moment that I met you in the museum, and I still kind of figure out what to do with this. Somehow I think that's the evidence we need. We need to go beyond the classical numbers. We need to go into this, somehow tracking or becoming aware of how we're actually really changing people's habits maybe and behaviors by, sometimes it's just one tiny encounter that they might have had with that creative practice.
Now the question's settled, I can also answer this question a little bit. Actually, I think partly through the prompt of the work with the creatures researchers, we have folded into the end of every LARP we do a process of reflection once we are out of character. So we do this kind of de-rolling and then reflection on what's just happened and what it feels like. And we've learnt now to take very close notice of what people say in those kind of sessions, because you get very deep responses from people as they move out of this imaginary world that they've just co-created into a reflective space where they can reflect as the humans that they are. And so one of the slides I didn't show was just a list of like what humans say after they've participated in a game of treaty. So that was one thing. And the other thing that I think, because we are a little bit kind of, we want to deliver evidence. And I think because we want resources to keep doing things at a greater scale, because it feels important, people are engaged, people coming back is some kind of evidence, people across different realms, so from professional, public, and kind of informal realms coming together repeatedly. They come back because something's happening, something's important, something's valuable to them. That feels like some kind of evidence. And then we're also creating our own evidence by co-creating a festival that we then put on, and then people will come to it. So we're kind of using it as a demonstrator for engagement with the topic. It's quite kind of recursive in a way, but I feel like there's something evidential about that. And then also, just finally, here we are in this Zoom room, and at least 3 people here still have as their profile pictures the species that they played in a game of treaty online. And I like to think of 60 people around the world constantly turning up as a tree or as a goose. And maybe sometimes they might even stick their animated digital masks on and have a laugh with someone. And they're just kind of maintaining this connection that they can then come back and play again. So it's kind of leaking into their lives, I think.
Yeah, I want to bring in Marion, because Marion, you talked a lot about experimental approaches, and that like quite a lot of the value of experimental approaches, that's kind of what creative practice brings, that it can kind of hold that space. And it feels to me like there's kind of an interlacing here, like kind of bringing experimentation and bringing these
Okay, I think that happened while trying to admit the person to the Zoom room. Just give it a second. Okay, we are back on.
Recording in progress.
So definitely in the context which I'm working now is we're thinking about, okay, we're using co-design, we're using participatory practice to design policy. And that is experimental in its context. And the question then is, how do we know it's being done properly? How do we measure it? How do we assure participation? And I'm sure there's lots of answers in this room. But kind of when I've been sort of coaching people who are trying that for the first time, my kind of spectrum at the moment is, and it's from people who have spoken to me, have said, it feels like it's just a tick box exercise, and that's that's great. That's a really good, solid thing that people feel. And on the other hand, you've got people saying like, oh, I think it went really well. And I like came away like really feeling that I connected with someone, which I don't know how you measure those things, but as long as people are able to communicate that and tell those stories, and that becomes really important for those experimental processes. Yeah, and I think we've spoken about it before, about the kind of all the time that goes into organizing these events. It was kind of in that question of the legacy, like what goes on. It's like, yeah, these things will take longer and it will take a lot more of our energy. So I think it's kind of, while we might not be able to measure exactly those things, it is again on us to show our working and keep talking about this behind the scenes hard work that goes in.
Can I just add to that quickly? I mean,
definitely
talking about.
So I want to invite any other questions.
I don't think this is
and
working.
If there are none, I've got loads.
Sorry, I don't think they're hearing us here.
Hi, thank you so much to all the panelists. It's been so exciting and really inspiring to hear all your projects. And I've heard of a few of them before, so it's great to kind of hear new and also kind of an expanded view of kind of all the different parts that's going on. I also work a little bit in the policy kind of space, and I think one of the things that often ends up happening when we do things like speculative design or participatory design, or even trying to bring kind of things like film ethnography in, is, you know, you have all these really rich, lovely reflections and data, but then they kind of get funneled through into a bit more policy language as they go through to different kind of more senior people and so forth. And I'm just wondering from the panelists, when, you know, do you find that you have to put some of your work into, let's say, policy speak or policy documents at some point? And do you think that that changes or has an effect in some way the work and the capacity building that you do? And, you know, how do you kind of mitigate that?
Oh, great question, Nina. Who would be best placed to answer that? I feel like Marion and Irena are probably closest to the kind of policy speak.
I'm not going to lie, I don't do policy speak the same way. I almost resist academic speak. I just say it how it is. So that might not be the answer you were hoping for.
Yeah, I can try if you can hear me. Can you hear me now? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Super. Thank you. This is working now. Yeah, things get lost in translation. That's just the starting point, I suppose. But the big challenge of that is, I guess, figuring out how do you communicate things in a simple way, but just simple enough and not too simple without like losing all of the nuance and all of the complexity and all of the detail. And I think like there is the formal interface of all of these, like, yes, there's these policy briefings, yes, there's all of these formal documents, but that's almost like that's a facade, the front desk of a thing. And there's so much more depth that actually of how, you know, how do you create spaces to discuss those? Who hears this? And all these conversations that are happening in between that matter, because you can only explain so much in any piece of text or video or some non-person situation. So I think the way that we try to kind of bridge those worlds, and like I personally jump a lot in between. Yeah, sometimes jump, sometimes glide, sometimes ski in between the worlds of, you know, the very kind of the art, the academic, and the policy speak. And and it's also frustrating very often because you think, whoa, I really want to be using this kind of words, but then they just kind of, you know, it's very easy to alienate people completely by speaking the language that they don't speak, and that goes, you know, all sorts of ways. And can I just say, while I have the microphone, very quickly on this question of evidence, I think that is such a interesting way, that kind of the way that we spoke about it just now, in a way that kind of, yes, there's ways of thinking about, well, you can't talk about evidence as some abstract thing. You always like, you know, it's evidence of what? And I think I find it kind of disconnected from the real material world and all the crises that we are living in, when these kind of discussions about evidence go only about like, okay, how many people have attended, or these kind of like more meta abstract things, and not about, okay, this peatland bog somewhere, what has changed for this environment in particular, you know, has it been regenerated in some way? And I really wish I really wish I had more stories to tell from the examples that I've been bringing from the flood risk management and all the watery things of how that particular water body is now having a better life, how maybe the fish in there are living better life, how all the ecosystem that it supports is flourishing now. But I don't have that story, and I would love to be able to see if, how actually these kind of creative practices bring us towards that, because I don't want also to be living in a place where, I just tell myself this nice story that it works, but then on the material reality, nothing changes. Sorry, that's a bit of a sad point there. Anyone like to carry on from there?
Well, I think it's really interesting that Nina asked that question, because I realize I don't often talk about evidence, but in the context of talking about policy, the notion of evidence-based is, it's a very live thing. So one of the reasons for asking that question was just because I think it means such different things depending where you're coming from. But now I'm wondering whether there's someone else. Yeah, I think please, Tuli.
Thanks a lot. I was involved in one of the workshops as one of the creative practitioners, but also a participant. And thinking about evidence, I have followed, not really noted down, but really followed what had happened to me afterwards. I've collected about maybe 10 liters of rubbish, pieces of glass over the beaches. I've tried to show that example to others. I've started conversations with so many people about full moon, selkies, seals, seaweed, gutweed, all these kind of things that had led to new conversations. Just the other day, I was watching the Creatures exhibition at Aalto University, where we had 30 students from high school nearby, very much engaged in looking at the tarot cards and whatnot. And the teacher was there, and I started talking with her about the hopefulness of creative practices. And she was so thrilled about the whole exhibition that she already told me that she had been there with 3 other classes, so that makes already 100 students. And so forth. So we have lots of these kind of tiny bits of evidence, but we should also think about them as good stories to tell. That's my thinking.
Oh, and just to clarify, Tuli's giving an account of Julia's work, so maybe you want to say something, Julia?
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing the story, Tuli. I had a similar situation, like we curated this exhibition in a design museum about ocean health and critical engagement called Critical Tide. And the museum called me and said, oh, there is the mayor of Beijing visiting Helsinki. Would you show him around? And I was like, oh, wow, 15 minutes, or I think it was 8 minutes with the mayor of Beijing showing him the exhibition. So I actually researched and found out that he studied at Imperial College London, and he has his PhD in water waste management. And we had this one exhibit in the exhibition by Matters of Trust, the charity that makes these wonderful hair mats that can go into the gutters to collect all the oil that is running off the roads and then going into the sea. So I really took the time to actually explain him this hair mat piece, and he completely skipped with his translator, and he got super engaged, and we had this really engaged discussion, and he left with the words saying, oh, I could check whether we can do this in Beijing. And I was like, oh my God, what if this one moment in a gallery actually changes and actually gets him to say, well, let's see whether we can use something like this. This is kind of the moments when you really think, I don't know whether I can prove it, but this is the biggest chance I'll ever have to have an impact.
Oh, thanks. And we've got 3 minutes left, and I would love to ask a question that follows directly on from that. And it's about relationships, because I think that has been a massive theme throughout this whole panel. gaining relationships, keeping them, stepping into them to have exchanges with people. We've talked about it in influencing, and also now in evidence that actually changing, being a part of a relationship that changes someone's worldview. So I think I'm really curious to hear from the panel, like, there are so many tacit practices like facilitation and relationship building that never get shared. And so I wondered if anyone wanted to share their kind of top tips for kind of creating and maintaining these kind of sensitive and reflective relationships within the policy community, or indeed with scientists, as I know some of your work, the panelists' work, it involves. It is a hats question, Marion. You've said that in the chat. Do you want to say it out loud for the Prague folk? I don't think they.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that came to mind when you said relationship was this like weird feeling I have, which is, my traditional textile training and that amazing tradition that I come from, and then I'm in this space which like sometimes feels so far away, and people will be like, how did you get from there to there? And I'm like, no, it's a straight line. It makes so much sense to me, but kind of I do try to pop up and be part of that community that kind of gave me my kind of platform, family maybe, and then just like trying to work out the connections and then learning, seeing where other people have gone and trying to fill it in. But it does involve a lot of being on Twitter in lots of different communities all at once and trying to remember who you are in a day. So it's not easy. Don't know if there's a top tip in there, but don't remember where you came from. Don't forget where you came from. Maybe it's a good one. I feel very protected by my textile community.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, I can.
And you, yep, please go for it.
Yeah, I feel like at first when you just asked that, I was tempted to say maybe some more like generic things around like, patience and all of those things and different worldviews. But I think there's a more interesting point to be made there around knowing what you try to create in these interactions, but also, and like hugely importantly, what you're trying to resist, because it's not a neutral space of all these nice ideas. No, there's really some very harmful things that need to be resisted, and coming into those interactions, you always need to know where you stand and how to defend those positions, because this kind of work that we're talking about is very strongly rooted in ecological justice and social climate justice, and you need to be able to kind of really be grounded in that and not give up those values, ideals that you're working towards just because they're misunderstood or resisted. So yeah, knowing what you create and resist is a way to summarize that.
Thanks, Irina. And Julia, you've got your hand up. Is that to say something? Yeah, brilliant.
Yes, so just completely seconding this, shared values, so that we are kind of aiming for the same goal, and knowing that we do. And then I think the other is also knowing how we can add to each other's work. So knowing that the other might have different methods that they can employ, and that we have to have all these methods combined to actually make something happen. So really just kind of appreciating the other methods. And I think this is something where we as creative practitioners can do a lot more, because quite often people don't know what we can offer. So we have to be the one knocking on the door saying, yes, I can help you make the slideshow, but I think there's also other things I can do.
Brilliant. And maybe we can give Ruth the last word.
I was really pleased to hear Julia say this thing of like seeing how you can add to other people's work. For Treaty, I have sat down and had a 2-hour cup of tea with our park ranger once every 6 months to get the full download of where he's at, because he is such an amazing community connector in our park. And he knows where the levers of power are. So finding the connectors and really working out how you can support their work if you have shared aims and values, which in this case we do, has been very important, supporting his work and also informing our work.
Brilliant. So I think we're about 3 minutes over time. Are we okay to close? I want to just check in with Anne and the room in Prague.
Well, I want to comment on what a wonderful set of connections have been made, I think, between people from different perspectives this afternoon, and thank the Uroboros Festival for inviting us, and Creatures Project for organising it, and Sussex for sponsoring it, and just hand back for any kind of last words. But it's been, great from here. Thanks everyone for coming out.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, the panelists and the moderators, both here and online. I was just now thinking, and it's not a question because, yes, we are over time, but at the same time as we have the Uroboros Festival, there is the EPC Summit in Prague, the European Political Community meeting. And it's kind of, I don't know, maybe, I hope not symbolic, but we are sitting in this empty swimming pool having our, Feral Policy panel at Art Festival. And then there's this massive summit happening elsewhere in other buildings. And I wonder if one day we will be able to better build some connections, maybe between those two worlds. But I really see a point of doing these things. We need to start from somewhere with events like this. It's really not a question at all. It's more a rumble.
A very valid observation. Yes.
Observation.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, everyone, wherever you are. And the recording will be online, so anybody can watch it later. We will send you the link so you can share it with others as well. And thank you so much.
Thanks, panelists. Thanks, Lara. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marquesa.
Thank you.